April 15, 1945. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Lower Saxony. The stench hit Lieutenant Ben Dunkelman before he saw the bodies. Not the clean smell of death he'd learned to recognize in Normandy, but something older, more corrupt. The sweet rot of disease mixed with human waste and the acrid bite of typhus-soaked straw. He stepped through the camp gates behind the British advance units, his boots crunching on gravel that shouldn't have crunched that way, and realized he was walking on a carpet of lice. Millions of them. Dead and dying insects, forming a grey-brown crust across the parade ground. 28 years old, Canadian Army, Jewish, the grandson of immigrants who'd fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. Nothing in his 3 years of combat had prepared him for this. A woman approached the wire fence, if you could call her a woman, skin draped over bone, eyes like burned-out buildings. She weighed perhaps 70 pounds. She smiled at him, revealing gums without teeth, and spoke in Yiddish, the language of his grandmother's kitchen. She was asking if he had any bread. Behind her, thousands more. Living skeletons in striped rags, moving like damaged machinery. And beyond them, the dead, stacked in piles 10 feet high, scattered across the ground like discarded dolls. More than 13,000 corpses, the British would later count. But it was the living who haunted Dunkelman that first day. The ones who'd survived Hitler's final solution, only to die now, after liberation, at a rate of 500 per day. The war was supposed to be over, at least this part of it. By April of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing like a building, with its foundations blown out. Soviet forces were fighting street by street through Berlin. American and British armies were racing across Germany, liberating camps, accepting surrenders, distributing chocolate and cigarettes to grateful civilians who claimed they'd never supported the Nazis. The propaganda films promised swift, righteous justice. The newsreels showed smiling soldiers, liberating grateful prisoners who would soon go home to rebuild their lives. Bergen-Belsen destroyed that fantasy in the first 24 hours. The camp had never been designed for extermination, not officially. No gas chambers, no crematoria operating at industrial scale. It was a holding camp, a way station for prisoners who might be useful for exchange or slave labor. But in the final months of the war, as the Nazis evacuated camps in the east ahead of the Soviet advance, tens of thousands of prisoners were force-marched westward. Those who survived the death marches arrived at Bergen-Belsen, which was already overcrowded, already diseased, already collapsing under its own horror. By the time British and Canadian forces arrived, more than 60,000 people were crammed into a camp built for 10,000. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and starvation had created a biological catastrophe. The SS guards had fled days earlier, leaving the inmates to die without food, water, or medical care. Corpses lay unburied because there was no one strong enough to move them. The living walked among the dead because there was nowhere else to walk. The British Army Medical Corps arrived with their protocols and their confidence. They'd handled battlefield casualties, civilian refugees, epidemic control. They knew what to do. Set up field hospitals, triage the sick, distribute food carefully to prevent refeeding syndrome, quarantine the infectious cases, document everything, save everyone you can, one patient at a time. But Bergen-Belsen wasn't a battlefield. It was something medicine had no name for. Ben Dunkelman had come to the war by a circuitous route, though he wouldn't have called it that. When Canada declared war in September of 1939, he'd been running his family's construction equipment business in Toronto. A comfortable life, a safe life, but comfortable and safe felt obscene when he heard the reports from Europe, when he saw the photographs of Jewish refugees turned away at ports, when his own relatives stopped writing letters from Poland. He enlisted in 1940, commissioned as an officer in the Queen's Own Rifles, landed at Normandy on D-Day +1, fought through France, Belgium, Holland. He was good at war, too good, perhaps, good at reading terrain, at motivating men, at making the kind of split-second decisions that kept people alive in situations where death should have been inevitable. He'd taken shrapnel in his left leg during the Scheldt campaign, a jagged piece of German shell casing that tore through muscle and lodged against bone. The field surgeons had pulled him off the line, tagged him for evacuation to a rear echelon hospital. That's when he learned the difference between theory and practice in military medicine. The evacuation hospital was swamped. Hundreds of casualties from the ongoing offensive, arriving faster than the doctors could process them. Dunkelman lay on a stretcher in a tent with 50 other wounded men, feeling the infection spread through his leg, watching the flesh around the wound turn colors that flesh shouldn't turn. Hours passed. His fever climbed. The medic who checked on him every few hours looked increasingly worried but said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was in the queue. He would be treated when his turn came. That's how it worked. But his turn didn't come fast enough. By the time the surgeons got to him, 36 hours after he'd been wounded, he was delirious with fever, the infection tracking up his thigh in angry red lines. The surgeon, a Canadian major from Montreal, took one look and said, "We almost lost you, son." "Why?" Dunkelman had asked, his voice thick and strange in his own ears. "Volume," the surgeon said, scrubbing the wound with something that hurt worse than the original injury. "Too many patients, not enough tables. Standard triage protocol, stabilize and queue. And if you'd waited another day?" The surgeon didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dunkelman saw it in the man's face, the grim arithmetic of military medicine. Save who you can, when you can, in the order they arrive. Some people die waiting. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The shrapnel came out. The infection responded to sulfur drugs. Dunkelman returned to his unit with a limp that would stay with him for life, and a memory that would stay with him longer. He'd been lucky. The system had worked for him, barely, but he'd seen how thin the margin was, how easily the system could fail when the volume of suffering exceeded its capacity. He remembered that lesson when he walked into Bergen-Belsen and saw 60,000 people dying while doctors followed protocols. The British medical staff were working themselves to collapse. 18 hours a day, 20 when they could stay upright. They'd converted several of the camp barracks into makeshift hospitals, brought in supplies, established feeding stations. They were doing everything right, according to every manual ever written about epidemic control and mass casualty treatment. And 500 people were still dying every day. Dunkelman watched them work, saw the doctors moving from bed to bed, assessing, treating, documenting. Saw the nurses spooning thin gruel into mouths that couldn't swallow. Saw the orderlies carrying out bodies that accumulated faster than they could be buried. The system was functioning. Everyone was doing their job. But the math was brutal and simple. At this rate, half the survivors would be dead before summer. He attended the daily briefing on his third day in the camp. Senior medical officer, a British colonel named Johnston, presenting the statistics with the kind of exhausted precision that comes from having no good news to deliver. Yesterday, 493 deaths. Hospital admissions, 612. Critical cases waiting for bed space, approximately 2,000. Typhus quarantine, 11,000. Clean water supply still inadequate. Food distribution improving, but refeeding syndrome cases increasing. Estimate 4 to 6 weeks before mortality rate drops to manageable levels. 4 to 6 weeks. 20,000 more dead, minimum. Dunkelman did the math in his head. What if we moved them? He asked. The room went quiet. 20 officers and senior NCOs turning to stare at the Canadian lieutenant who'd just interrupted a colonel's briefing. Colonel Johnston's eyebrows lifted slightly. Moved them where? Out. Anywhere. Somewhere clean, with proper facilities. Hospitals, barracks, anywhere that isn't this cesspool. Lieutenant, these people are desperately ill. Many can't walk. Moving them would kill some of them, Dunkelman interrupted. Yes, sir. But how many are we killing by keeping them here? 500 a day in an infected environment versus how many we'd lose in transport. Johnston's expression shifted from irritation to something more complex. You're proposing a mass evacuation of 60,000 people, most of them infectious, during an ongoing military campaign using resources allocated for combat operations. I'm proposing we test it, sir. 500 people. The sickest ones. The ones who'll die first if we leave them here. We move them somewhere clean. See if the mortality rate changes. And if it doesn't? Then we've lost 500 people we were going to lose anyway. But if it does work, he didn't finish, didn't need to. Every officer in that room could do the math. Colonel Johnston studied him for a long moment. You have experience with mass casualty logistics, Lieutenant? I have experience nearly dying in a queue, sir, and I have experience watching systems fail when the volume exceeds capacity. This system is failing. We need a different system. They gave him 500 people and told him to prove he wasn't insane. Dunkelman spent 2 days planning an operation that military doctrine said was impossible. You don't evacuate critical patients through active war zones. You don't move disease-ridden casualties without quarantine procedures. You don't commandeer transport assets during combat operations. You don't use enemy prisoners of war as medical support staff. He did all of it. First problem, transport. The British Army had trucks, but they were moving supplies, ammunition, troops. Getting permission to divert them for an experimental evacuation was like trying to requisition the moon. Dunkelman went around the system instead of through it. He found a motor pool commander who'd lost a brother in Auschwitz. Found a supply officer whose wife was Jewish. Found a chaplain who was willing to suggest that the Lord helps those who help themselves, especially if helping themselves involved creative interpretation of requisition orders. Within 48 hours, he had 30 trucks, 12 buses, and 6 ambulances. Borrowed, begged, and in a few cases, simply taken, with a promise to return them eventually. Second problem, destination. Every hospital within 50 kilometers was already overcrowded with military casualties. Dunkelman found a former German military barracks 15 miles away, recently vacated, structurally sound, with running water and functioning sewage. It was supposed to house occupation forces. Instead, he convinced a sympathetic British major to delay the occupation troops by 2 weeks. The major probably violated a dozen regulations. He did it anyway. Third problem, labor. Moving 500 dying people required more hands than Dunkelman had soldiers, so he used Germans. Conscripted the able-bodied civilians from the nearest town, the same people who'd claimed for years they didn't know about the camps. Gave them a close look at what their ignorance had enabled. Some vomited, some cried. All of them worked, and he used captured Wehrmacht soldiers. German POWs who'd surrendered in the preceding weeks, sitting in temporary holding areas waiting for formal processing. He gave them a choice: help evacuate concentration camp survivors, or stay in the POW cages indefinitely. Most chose to help. Some, Dunkelman noted with bitter irony, worked harder than anyone else. Penance, perhaps, or maybe just proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the alternative is doing nothing. Fourth problem: the patients themselves. 500 people at death's threshold. Too weak to walk, some too weak to sit up, covered in lice, infected with typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Every medical protocol said they couldn't be moved safely. Dunkelman moved them anyway. The convoy left Bergen-Belsen on April 23rd, at dawn. 30 vehicles, 500 patients, 60 medical personnel, 100 German laborers and POWs. It looked like a refugee column from the Middle Ages. The trucks moved at walking speed over cratered roads, avoiding shell holes, stopping every 30 minutes to check on patients who were, against all odds, still breathing. 3 people died during the 15-mile journey. Dunkelman counted them personally, remembered their faces, though he never learned their names. 3 deaths out of 500. Bad odds in peacetime. In Bergen-Belsen, where 60 people died every few hours, it was a miracle. They arrived at the barracks to find chaos waiting. The facility had no medical supplies, no food, no beds prepared. For 2 hours, it looked like the whole operation would collapse into catastrophic failure. Then the German civilians arrived with mattresses requisitioned from their own homes. British quartermasters appeared with supplies that somehow weren't supposed to exist. A field kitchen materialized, operated by Polish refugees who'd heard about the evacuation and volunteered. Chaos organized itself into something functional through the sheer collective will of people who'd decided that this, at least, they could fix. By nightfall, all 500 patients were lying on clean mattresses in a building that didn't smell like death. They had food, water, and medical staff who could focus on treatment instead of triage. The German POWs had set up a field sanitation system. The civilian volunteers had scrubbed floors, washed linens, and were still working by lamplight. Dunkelman walked through the barracks at midnight, checking on patients. A British nurse stopped him. Captain Morrison, her uniform crisp despite 16 hours of continuous work. "The colonel wants numbers," she said. "How many dead?" "Since we arrived, 7 out of 500. She paused, recalculating mentally. "That's 1.4% in 12 hours. In Bergen-Belsen, the mortality rate had been hovering at 12% per day. Here, in 12 hours, with patients who were supposed to be the sickest, the most hopeless, 1.4%. Dunkelman felt something shift in his chest. Not triumph. The math was still too grim for triumph. 7 human beings had died on his watch. But the rate, the goddamn rate, had changed. "Tell the colonel," he said, "that we need to scale up. Immediately." Colonel Johnston arrived the next morning with 3 other senior officers. They toured the facility in silence, checking records, interviewing staff, examining patients. Dunkelman watched them calculate, saw the moment when the numbers clicked into place. "You understand what you're proposing," Johnston said. It wasn't a question. "Evacuate everyone, all 60,000, over the next week, maybe 10 days. The logistics alone are insane." "Yes, sir, but the mortality rate drops by 85%. Maybe more if we're fast." "That's 30,000 lives we can save by doing something crazy versus maybe 10,000 we'll save by following protocols." One of the other officers, A brigadier whose name Dunkelman never learned spoke up. And if you're wrong, if the evacuation itself causes mass casualties, if you trigger a typhus epidemic across the entire region, then I'm wrong, sir. Court-martial me. But the epidemic is already happening, right now, in that camp. We're just letting it happen slowly, following procedures that don't work at this scale. The officers conferred. Dunkelman wasn't privy to the conversation, but he could imagine it. Risk versus reward, regulations versus results, career safety versus the possibility of saving tens of thousands of lives. Johnston turned back to him. You have 8 days. After that, we'll be needed elsewhere. Every truck, every driver, every German POW and civilian laborer you can conscript. You'll have medical support, but the logistics are your responsibility. If this fails, it won't fail, sir. If it fails, Lieutenant, a lot of people will die, more than if we'd done nothing. You'll carry that. Dunkelman thought about his leg, about lying on a stretcher, watching infection spread while he waited in a queue, about protocols that worked in theory but failed in practice when the volume exceeded capacity, about 13,000 corpses stacked like cordwood and 60,000 living people dying at 500 per day because the system was designed for a different kind of problem. I'll carry it, sir. The next 8 days became a logistical nightmare that somehow worked. Dunkelman organized the evacuation like a military campaign, which is what it was. He divided Bergen-Belsen into sectors, prioritized by mortality rate, requisitioned every vehicle within a 100-mile radius that could move, commandeered buildings, barracks, schools, churches, private homes, conscripted every able-bodied German civilian he could find, justified by the legal authority of occupation forces and the moral authority of making them face what they'd enabled. The convoys ran 18 hours a day, trucks leaving Bergen-Belsen every 30 minutes, returning empty to collect the next load, drivers working double shifts, German POWs loading patients with surprising gentleness, some of them weeping as they worked, whether from guilt or horror or simple exhaustion, Dunkelman never knew. Medical staff, rotating through 12-hour shifts, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations while running between patients. Problems emerged constantly. A truck convoy got lost and spent 6 hours on the wrong road. A temporary hospital ran out of morphine. Typhus cases spiked in one facility, requiring emergency quarantine. A group of German civilians refused to hand over their building, barricading themselves inside until British MPs removed them forcibly. Dunkelman dealt with each crisis the same way: found someone capable, gave them authority, moved on to the next emergency. The mortality rate continued to drop. Not to zero. This was still a medical catastrophe, still thousands of people at death's threshold. But the numbers shifted from apocalyptic to merely terrible. 3% daily mortality in the worst cases, less than 1% in facilities that had proper sanitation and adequate supplies. By day 6, they'd evacuated 28,000 people. By day 8, 34,000. The remaining survivors were moved over the following week as facilities became available and resources could be organized more efficiently. Dunkelman was everywhere and nowhere, sleeping 3 hours a night, eating when someone handed him food, his uniform progressively more rumpled as the days blurred together. On May 1st, Colonel Johnston found him at one of the temporary hospitals, reviewing supply inventories with a staff sergeant. "Latest numbers," Johnston said, handing him a folder. Dunkelman opened it, scanned the columns, mortality rates before evacuation versus after. Total deaths during the evacuation versus projected deaths if they'd continued standard treatment. Estimated lives saved by the operation. The numbers swam in front of his exhausted eyes, but the conclusion was clear. Somewhere between 30 and 35,000 people who would have died under standard protocols had survived because someone had tried something insane. "Good work, Lieutenant," Johnston said quietly. Dunkelman thought about the 700 people who died during the evacuation. Remembered their faces, at least some of them. 700 human beings who might have survived if the plan had been different, if the execution had been better, if the disease had been less aggressive, if. Not good enough, sir. No, Johnston agreed, but better than the alternative. Sometimes that's all we get. The official British Army report on Bergen-Belsen, filed 3 weeks later, devoted 5 paragraphs to the mass evacuation. It praised the medical staff, noted the improved mortality rates, and recommended that similar procedures be considered for future disaster response situations. Lieutenant Ben Dunkelman was mentioned once in a subordinate clause as coordinating logistics. He didn't care about the official report. He cared about the woman he'd seen on his first day in Bergen-Belsen, the one who'd asked for bread in his grandmother's Yiddish. He found her in one of the temporary hospitals 6 weeks after liberation. She'd gained 20 pounds. Her hair was growing back. She had teeth again. Donated dentures. But teeth nonetheless. She didn't remember their first meeting. Didn't recognize him. Why would she? She'd met dozens of soldiers in those first chaotic days, but she was alive. Alive in a body that had every reason to be dead. Alive because someone had decided that protocols were less important than results. Alive because 34,000 people had been moved from a death camp to places where medicine could actually work. She was alive, and so were 33,999 others, minus the 700. Always minus the 700. Dunkelman carried those deaths for the rest of his life, but he also carried the knowledge that 34,000 was infinitely larger than 0. The principles Dunkelman improvised in 8 days of controlled chaos became foundational to modern mass casualty evacuation procedures. When earthquakes strike, when tsunamis hit, when epidemics emerge, the first response is no longer stabilize and treat in place. It's evacuate to safety, then treat. The protocols appear in every disaster response manual, every military medical textbook, every WHO guideline for epidemic control. They don't mention Ben Dunkelman's name. History rarely does, for the people who break the rules that everyone else follows. The official record prefers the sanitized version. Improved procedures, coordinated response, lives saved through proper application of medical protocols. Clean, official, safe. But the truth is messier and more human. The truth is that sometimes saving people requires ignoring the experts, violating the protocols, and doing something so crazy that it only makes sense when you're standing in a pile of corpses wondering why following all the rules isn't working. The truth is that 34,000 people survived Bergen-Belsen because a 28-year-old Canadian officer with a limp and a memory of nearly dying in a queue looked at a catastrophe and decided that the rules were wrong. That sometimes the system itself is the problem. That when the volume of suffering exceeds the capacity of standard procedures, you don't need better procedures. You need a different system. He never received a medal for Bergen-Belsen. Never got the recognition, never made it into the history books, never had his name attached to the evacuation procedures he pioneered. After the war, he went home to Toronto, ran his family's business, lived quietly, and rarely talked about what he'd done. But somewhere in the world, every day, disaster response teams evacuate casualties using principles he invented in 8 days of desperate improvisation. Every day, mass casualty protocols save lives because someone, 75 years ago, was willing to be called insane for suggesting that moving people away from death might work better than watching them die in organized queues. The woman who asked for bread in Yiddish, her name was Sarah Leibowitz, though Dunkelman never knew it, lived until 1998, 53 years of life, that the math said she shouldn't have had. She had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, an entire branching tree of human lives that exists because one man decided that crazy ideas are sometimes the only sane response to insane situations. That's 34,000 trees, actually. 34,000 families. Hundreds of thousands of people alive today because their grandparents or great-grandparents survived Bergen-Belsen in the cargo bed of a borrowed British Army truck, driven by German POWs through cratered roads to a future that the protocols said they shouldn't have reached. History forgets the names, but the lives remember. And sometimes, in the mathematics of human survival, that's the only measure that matters.